there's a kind of silence that doesn't feel empty. It feels weighted, like something's pressing down on your chest, asking you to forget what you know, to pretend you didn't see what you saw, to bury what's already trying to breathe. Maya Ellison was only 15 when she realized the world wasn't going to save her father's name. And maybe the hardest part wasn't the grief. It was watching everyone else move on, like he had never mattered in the first place. There are moments in life when you know if you stay quiet, they win. But what happens when you speak and the room still turns away? What she did next didn't come from anger. It came from something quieter, more dangerous, a decision. And once she made it, there was no turning back. Let me tell you what happened the day Maya walked into that courtroom again. The courtroom smelled like old wood and stale coffee. Somewhere in the back, a fluorescent light buzzed faintly, barely heard over the murmurs and creaking benches. Rows of people packed the room shoulder to shoulder, some clutching notebooks, others whispering into microphones, their cameras perched like vultures on tripods. But none of that mattered, because in the middle of it all stood a girl. She was 15. She wore a faded black dress that used to belong to her mother, and she was pointing at the judge. Her hand didn't shake. Her voice didn't crack. It only echoed. "He's not just the judge. He's the reason my father is dead." The room fell silent. Every head turned. Every eye locked on her. Someone gasped. A juror dropped his pen. But Maya Ellison didn't blink. She knew this silence. She had lived in it for months. Her father, Julian Ellison, had once been known across New Orleans as a hard-nosed journalist. Not flashy, not loud, just precise. A man who uncovered stories like a surgeon finds tumors quiet, methodical, and never missing. But that was before his car wrapped around a tree at 2 a.m., 2 days before his exposé on judicial corruption was set to publish. Before they called it a tragic accident. Before his notes vanished from the newsroom. Before the police told Maya, "Maybe your father was under pressure. Maybe he fell asleep at the wheel." Maybe. That word echoed like a curse. Maya didn't sleep much after that. Neither did her mother, for the short time she was still around. 3 weeks after the funeral, her mother packed a suitcase, kissed Maya on the forehead, and left a note on the kitchen counter. "I need air. I can't breathe here." She never came back. And just like that, Maya became the invisible girl in a city full of stories. She stopped talking in class, stopped eating lunch in the cafeteria, stopped smiling at the neighbors who said, "So sorry for your loss," while tossing trash bags into bins like they were talking about weather. People forgot she was 15. They looked at her like she was older, broken, like the cracked lamp in the hallway that no one bothered to fix because it still technically worked. At school, teachers whispered about her. One called her stoic, another called her troubled, a third called Child Protective Services. She smiled at that one just barely. The only place Maya found peace was her father's study, still untouched, still heavy with the smell of his aftershave and newsprint. She spent hours there, sitting in his old leather chair, pretending she could still hear the sound of his typing. One night, a floorboard squeaked beneath her. She reached down, curious, lifted it, and beneath it, just inches from the dust and silence, was a black notebook, bound in rubber bands, corners frayed, filled with her father's familiar, tight handwriting. And one name written again and again in the margins. Judge William Hawthorne. She didn't know what to make of it, not then. But her heart knew, and it clenched in her chest like it had recognized something before her mind could catch up. In the days that followed, she scoured the notebook. Names, dates, trial transcripts, red circles and arrows drawn in ink, margins filled with phrases like, "This wasn't a mistake. Check campaign donors." Same prosecutor, same pattern, same judge. It wasn't just notes. It was evidence. Her father hadn't just died. He had been silenced. Maya tried to tell someone. At first, she took the notebook to a local reporter. He smiled politely, then told her to come back with a parent. She mailed a copy of a page to a city council member. No reply. She even approached a public defender during recess at the courthouse. He glanced at the page, paled, and whispered, "Don't play with fire, kid." But it was already burning inside her. So when she saw the front page article that week, Judge Hawthorne presides over gang murder trial, she didn't hesitate. She showed up, not as a protester, not as a bystander, but as someone who refused to be erased. She sat in the back row in her father's coat, hands folded, watching the man her father feared most. And when the prosecution finished their statement, and when the defense lawyer looked away, and when the judge cleared his throat and leaned forward, Maya stood up, walked down the center aisle, every step echoing like a bell toll. People turned, confused, annoyed. A bailiff whispered harshly, but she didn't stop. She reached the center of the room, turned to face the judge, and pointed. "He's not just the judge," she said. "He's the reason my father is dead." They didn't arrest her. Not that day. Too many cameras. Too many eyes. They just escorted her out, gently but firmly, like she was a lost child who wandered too far from her seat. But in that moment, in that breathless, heavy, electric second, Maya Ellison had shattered something. And everyone knew it. Even the judge. Especially the judge. She walked home alone that day, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across cracked sidewalks. Strangers stared as she passed, their expressions a mix of curiosity and pity. But Maya didn't look at them, because for the first time in months, she wasn't trying to disappear. For the first time in months, someone had heard her voice, even if it only lasted 5 seconds. Even if they'd try to erase it. Even if the world still wanted her quiet. She wasn't quiet anymore. And far away, in a locked office on the 12th floor of the courthouse, Judge Hawthorne stared at a paused video clip on a monitor, Maya's face frozen mid-sentence. He didn't blink. He didn't speak. He simply reached for his phone and dialed. The next morning, there was a flyer taped to her locker. Attention seeker. Sharpie ink. All caps. Sloppy handwriting. The kind that didn't need a name because it carried the weight of everyone's silence. Maya tore it off without a word. She didn't cry. She just stared at the inside of the locker still, taped with an old photo of her and her dad on the Lake Pontchartrain pier. He was holding her fishing rod. She was pretending she caught something. Back then, life was noisy. Now the silence was everywhere. It hung in the cafeteria like fog. It dripped from the eyes of teachers who avoided hers. It echoed in the footsteps behind her that stopped when she turned around. That week, the school called her in. She sat across from the principal and 2 counselors, their voices calm, their eyes concerned but rehearsed. They asked if she was feeling unstable. They asked if she missed her father. They asked if she wanted to transfer to an alternative school until things settled down. She didn't answer. Not out of defiance, just didn't trust herself to speak without choking. The principal finally leaned forward. "Maya, your behavior yesterday disrupted an ongoing trial. It wasn't appropriate." She looked at him, then said quietly, "Neither was killing my father." They didn't respond to that. Just exchanged a look. That night, her apartment felt colder. The hallway light flickered. The radiator knocked. And as she sat in her father's old desk chair, flipping through his black notebook again, the loneliness thickened around her like fog rolling off the Mississippi. The notebook hadn't changed. The ink was still smudged at the corners where her dad pressed too hard. The lines still bent slightly where he'd scribbled too fast. Every page felt like his voice whispering in her ear. "They'll come at you sideways, not straight." She didn't know what that meant until the next morning. When she returned home from school, the front door was slightly open. Her lungs froze. She stepped inside slowly, every footstep quiet as snowfall. Nothing looked missing, nothing broken. But everything had moved an inch too far. Her toothbrush was wet. The lamp cord behind the couch was unplugged. The notepad on her kitchen counter had one page torn off. And on the refrigerator, a magnet was upside down. Only one person ever flipped it that way, her father, when he didn't want Maya snooping through the fridge before dinner. Her throat tightened. She rushed to his study, dropped to her knees, pulled up the loose floorboard. The notebook was still there, but the last page was gone. She didn't sleep that night. Not because of fear. That came later. That night was something worse. Humiliation. The kind that seeps into your skin when you realize no one is coming. Not the police, not the media, not even neighbors. You scream without opening your mouth, and the world keeps spinning. The next day, she showed the school security guard a photo of the broken magnet, told him someone had been in her home. He barely looked at it. You sure it wasn't just you? 3 days later, Maya walked 6 blocks through rain to meet a woman named Ms. Noreen. She used to be a city clerk, retired now, worn thin but sharp. Maya had seen her name in her dad's notes, underlined twice. Next to it, she knows where the files went. They met in an old diner on St. Claude Avenue. Noreen stirred her tea like it was her last ritual on earth. Her voice barely a whisper. I saw what you did in court. You shouldn't have. Maya swallowed. I had to. Noreen nodded, but her face didn't soften. Do you know what it cost him to get those files? What it cost me? Maya didn't, but she was starting to understand. Noreen handed her a crumpled envelope. This is all I have left. The rest's been buried or burned. Inside were photocopies, court memos, dismissal notices, internal emails. One thread from 2021 caught Maya's eye. Subject line, Re-Judge H. Leverage on Ellison? Body. He won't back off. If it escalates, we take the car route. Accidents happen. Her hands went cold. The silence wasn't accidental. It was orchestrated. On her walk home, a black SUV idled at the corner near her building. It didn't have plates. She waited 3 blocks before doubling back and circling through an alley. The SUV was gone, but the fear was not. That night, she backed all her files onto a flash drive, put it in a sock, taped it under the drawer of the dishwasher. No one would look there. She hoped. She left the rest of the notebook in the open. A decoy, a dare, a warning. Then she locked every door and lay in bed staring at the ceiling, waiting for footsteps. A week passed. No more flyers on her locker. No more stairs in the hallway. Instead, silence, which somehow felt worse, like the world had collectively decided to pretend she didn't exist. Until Tuesday. Ms. Bell, her English teacher, slipped her a note during class. It said only, "He taught me once. I believe you." Tucked inside the folded paper was a courtroom transcript, an old one from 2016, with red ink circling the line where Judge Hawthorne dismissed clear video evidence on a technicality. Below it, Bell had written, "He's been doing this for years." Maya nearly cried in the girls' bathroom stall. Not because it was proof, but because someone still saw her. The next day, Ms. Bell was absent. The day after that, she was fired. Inappropriate sharing of student records, the school said. Maya knew the truth. Another whisper silenced. Another voice gone. The silence was screaming now, and it was everywhere. Back home, Maya sat on the floor of the study, clutching the envelope Noreen gave her. She stared at the photo of her dad again, him holding that fishing rod, her laughing like the world hadn't cracked yet. And for the first time since this began, she whispered aloud, "I don't know if I can do this." No answer. Just the sound of the radiator clanking behind her, like bones. But then, something small happened. Her phone buzzed. An unknown number. No name. Just one sentence in the message. "They never thought you'd make it this far." She stared at it, then stared at it longer. Her fingers trembled, but not from fear. Because in that sentence was validation. The kind that says, you matter. They see you. They fear you. And that meant she was getting close. So she made a decision, not to fight louder, but to fight smarter. Because this wasn't just about her father anymore. It wasn't just about her pain. It was about every person they thought they could silence. That night, Maya didn't cry. She didn't hide. She sat back at her father's desk, opened the black notebook again, and began writing in her own ink. 1 page. Then 2. Then 20. She wrote everything she'd seen. Everyone who had helped. Everyone who had vanished. And at the bottom of the last page, she wrote, "This silence was never mine. I'm just the one who broke it." The public library on Esplanade Avenue still smelled like dust and forgotten bookmarks. Maya sat in the furthest corner, tucked between rows of history books no one read anymore. In front of her, an old laptop hummed faintly. The screen showed a paused video callet's grainy image frozen on the weary face of Amos Reese. She hadn't seen him since she was 9. Back then, Amos was a friend of her father's, a loud, sharp-witted investigative reporter who used to call her Lightning because she always asked the questions no one else dared to. Now he looked nothing like that. His hair had thinned. His eyes were dull behind scratched lenses. Wrinkles dragged the corners of his mouth down like gravity finally won. He'd become what the system does to men like her father, half ghost, half warning. But his voice? It still cut like glass. "Your father was close," Amos said slowly, like each word cost him. "Closer than he realized. That's why they moved on him. That's why I disappeared." Maya didn't blink. "So what do I do now?" Amos leaned forward until his face filled the screen. "You make noise, but not the kind they expect." Then he slid something into frame of flash drive. Battered, scratched, taped on one end. "Everything I managed to save. It's not enough for an indictment, but it's enough to blow holes in their story." That night, Maya picked up the drive in person, wrapped in an old candy wrapper, like something worthless. They didn't hug. They didn't speak long. Amos just pressed it into her hand and said one sentence before fading into the night. "Tell your story before they tell it for you." Inside the flash drive were court records, voice memos, campaign donation charts, and an audio clip. That clip changed everything. She hit play. At first, static. Then, "I've delivered on every ask, Judge. That kid should have been locked up." A pause. A sigh. "You'll get your endorsement. But I need the media quiet. And that reporter Ellison? He's making noise." A chuckle. Then, "Make sure he stops." Her hands went cold. It wasn't just that Judge Hawthorne was corrupt. It was that he'd been dealing in people's lives using prison cells like poker chips, selling futures for votes, and silencing the voices who tried to stop him. Her father hadn't been in the way. He had been the target. Maya spent the next 3 days printing copies, transcribing audio, backing up everything in triplicate. She stayed off her phone, changed her route to school, slept in different rooms. But the fear never left. It clung to her spine like a whisper that wouldn't shut up. Still, there was something else now. Direction. And for the first time, hope didn't feel like a luxury. It felt like a weapon. Monday morning came fast. The courthouse steps looked like a press junket, reporters lined up behind metal barriers, their cameras facing the doors like they were waiting for a movie star. Inside, the trial resumed. Same defendant, same prosecutor, same judge. But this time, Maya was ready. She wore her father's old leather jacket. Inside the lining, she'd stitched the flash drive. And in her hand, she held an envelope sealed with red wax. At 10:41 a.m., she walked into the courtroom. At 10:42, she sat in the front row. At 10:59, the courtroom went still as Judge Hawthorne banged the gavel and began reading procedural statements. At 11:05, Maya stood up. Not like before. No pointing, no accusations. Just her voice, quiet but sharp. "Your Honor, I request to submit evidence to the court as a material witness." Whispers swelled. The prosecutor turned. Hawthorne looked up. Cold. Calculating. "You're not on the docket, Miss Ellison." "Not yet," she replied, stepping forward. She handed the envelope to the clerk. "But what's inside is—" The clerk opened it, pulled out the transcript and flash drive. "Read the first line." Paused. Whispered something to the judge. The color drained from Hawthorne's face for just a second to flicker. Then he spoke. Recess. 30 minutes. Bailiff, clear the courtroom. Outside, the media caught the chaos. Cameras swiveled. Microphones stretched. But Maya didn't flinch. She didn't say a word. Just stood there on the courthouse steps, eyes forward, while the world wondered what just happened. Inside the judge's chambers, Hawthorne's voice was no longer cool. It was shaking. "Where the hell did she get that?" The clerk didn't answer. The prosecutor, however, did. "I think it's time to step down, Judge." Back in the hallway, a young attorney approached Maya. His badge read, David Langford, Public Defense Unit. He looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. Tie crooked, eyes bloodshot, but honest. "You've got more?" he asked. She nodded. "Then, let's finish this together." 3 hours later, Maya sat beside David at a private hearing. The courtroom was quiet, smaller. No cameras, just paperwork, legal pads, and power shifting in real time. David stood and read the transcript aloud. No one interrupted. Then he played the audio. No one breathed. When it ended, the review board looked at each other like people waking from a spell. And finally, one of them, a woman with silver hair and a faded scar down her cheek, spoke softly. "This is enough to launch a judicial ethics investigation." Maya didn't smile. She didn't cry. She just nodded. Because the war wasn't won. But a door had opened. And she'd kicked it. 2 days later, the New Orleans Times ran the headline, "Teen Whistleblower Exposes Judicial Corruption at City Hall." Maya's name wasn't on the front page. Her face wasn't in the article. But the words were hers. Her father's. And suddenly, people started talking again. Not just about the judge, but about Julian Ellison's stories, his legacy, his death, his truth. That night, Maya sat alone in the same diner where she once met Ms. Noreen. Same table, same flickering light above. She sipped lukewarm coffee and pulled out her journal. Wrote one sentence. "I was invisible. Then I spoke." She stared at the words. And underneath it, added, "And someone listened." The morning the judge resigned, there were no sirens, no parades, no big, sweeping press conference. Just a cold email from the State Judiciary Board. Subject line, "Effective immediately. William Hawthorne." Maya read it on a cracked screen in the back of a city bus, sitting between a woman arguing with her toddler and a man chewing sunflower seeds like it was survival. She didn't smile. She just stared at the words until they blurred, and let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding for a year. That night, the city's headlines danced around the truth. Longtime judge steps down amid ethics inquiry. Review board launches corruption probe in criminal division. Reckoning begins in Louisiana court system. They named law firms. They quoted experts. They buried the fire in paragraphs. But they didn't mention her father. They didn't mention Maya. And strangely, that felt right. Because this wasn't about credit. This was about clearing the air so the truth could finally breathe. A few days later, a knock came at the door. Not a loud one, just 3 soft raps, like someone who didn't want to startle anyone. Maya opened it to find Miss Belher, former English teacher, standing, with a reusable grocery bag and tired eyes. "I brought something," she said. Inside the bag was a stack of books. A People's History of the United States. Audre Lorde, The Selected Works. The Fire Next Time, by James Baldwin. And on top, a file folder. "Your father left these with me before he died," Miss Bell whispered. Said to wait. Said you'd know what to do with them. Maya's throat caught. No words. Just the sound of memory arriving like a windstorm. Inside the folder were handwritten essays, notes from interviews he never published, lists of names he'd circled, questions he never got to ask. One paper in particular stood out. A single line across the top. The story isn't about what they took. It's about what we refuse to surrender. Maya sat with that line for a long time. Not reading, not analyzing. Just feeling it settle inside her. Like armor made of truth. In the weeks that followed, people began showing up. Quietly. Slowly. A barista who had been arrested at 17 over a wrongful ID. A woman whose brother had been sentenced in Hawthorne's court for a crime someone else confessed to 2 years later. A retired bailiff who never spoke up but remembered every time the judge ignored evidence that didn't fit. They came with notes, photos, receipts, court dates, names, and stories. So many stories. All ending the same way. No one believed me. Until now. Until her. Maya didn't scream into microphones. She didn't post threads online or start a hashtag war. She just listened, took notes, cross-checked documents, created a spreadsheet with trial numbers, outcomes, inconsistencies. She started building a timeline, connecting her father's final year to a dozen others who had tried to speak. And each night, she updated the wall in her father's old study. Photos, pins, strings, case files. And a single quote in bold, black marker. They can't silence us all. One afternoon, a young assistant DA named Jonah Fields requested a private meeting. He was 28, nervous, wore too much cologne. But his eyes were clear. "I saw the files," he said. "They don't know I'm here." Maya nodded slowly. He slid a manila envelope across the cafe table. "That's the deposition Hawthorne buried. Your dad requested it twice." Inside, sworn testimony that proved a witness had been threatened during trial, the same trial that got her father killed. Maya didn't say thank you. She said, "Are you ready to lose your job?" He looked down, then said quietly, "I'd rather lose a paycheck than keep living in a lie." The story grew, but not loudly. More like roots underground. A community college professor offered to host a public reading of testimonies. A local filmmaker asked to document survivors' accounts. The city library set aside a room labeled Justice Archives, a name Maya never requested, but didn't fight. Because it wasn't about her anymore. It never was. She attended one of the hearings where a wrongfully convicted man was exonerated. He walked out of the courtroom without fanfare. No hugs. No music. Just fresh air and a borrowed coat. As he passed Maya, he stopped. "I read about you," he said, voice soft. "I didn't believe in people like you anymore." She didn't know what to say, but her hands found his briefly. And it was enough. Later that month, a small neighborhood magazine asked to do a piece. They called her a hero. She declined the interview. Instead, she sent them a quote from her father's journal. "Heroes are people who stay upright when no one's clapping." They printed it on the front page anyway. Underneath a photo of the courthouse steps. Empty. Rain slicked. Still. Not long after, Maya sat with Amos Reese again. He looked older, somehow, but less haunted. They drank weak coffee from plastic cups and watched a janitor sweep leaves from a park path. "You did it," Amos said. Maya shook her head. "I started it. That's different." He smiled faintly. "You ever think about going into journalism?" She let the silence stretch. Then, "No, but I've thought about law." Amos let out a soft, choked laugh. God help the system. That night, she went back to the courthouse. Not for a trial. Not for a protest. Just to walk the halls where her father once stood. She reached the room where he'd covered his final case. The one with the cracked window, the creaky floorboard. Inside, it was quiet. Not the suffocating kind. The sacred kind. She lit a single tea light. placed it on the floor, and whispered, "You were right." Then she stood up and left. No tears, just the quiet strength of someone who'd been bent but never broken. The courtroom had been renovated. New benches, fresh paint. Even the gavel looked different, polished, lighter. But Maya knew better. What had changed wasn't the room. It was what the room now remembered. It had been 6 months since Judge William Hawthorne resigned in disgrace. 4 months since the DA's office launched an internal audit of 137 prior convictions under his bench. 3 months since the city quietly dropped its opposition to reopening Julian Ellison's final investigation. And 42 days since Maya received a letter. It wasn't official. No court seal, no formal request. Just a plain envelope, handwritten. "We'd like to dedicate the room where your father first testified to his memory, if that's something you'd be willing to allow." She read the letter 3 times, then folded it, placed it in her father's journal, and left it there. Because allow wasn't the right word. The room was already his. The dedication ceremony was small. No press. Just a few rows of folding chairs, a tray of cold lemonade, and a new plaque on the wall that read, "The Ellison Hearing Room, dedicated to Julian Ellison for the stories that refused to stay buried." Maya didn't speak. She didn't have to. Her presence was enough. The quiet girl who had once stood in the center of a courtroom and pointed at a judge now stood beside a plaque with her father's name engraved in steel. That was more than justice. That was memory made permanent. After the ceremony, people filtered out one by one. A few shook her hand. One woman pressed a note into Maya's palm. "You gave me courage to testify." She never saw the woman again. But she kept the note, folded it into the lining of her coat, just like she once hid a flash drive. Not as a weapon this time, but as proof. Outside, the sky was soft. That in-between color just before dusk, where everything feels suspended. Maya walked past the courthouse steps where she had once stood, trembling and defiant. This time, her hands were steady. She crossed Poydras Street, walked 2 blocks east, and stopped in front of a building no one used to look at twice. It had been an abandoned public records hall. Now, the windows glowed warm from inside. On the door, etched in clean white letters, "The Ellison Center for Civic Integrity." No logo, no tagline, just truth, plain and permanent. Inside were walls lined with case files, audio transcripts, recorded testimonies, a resource hub for students, legal interns, and investigative journalists. Some called it a memorial. Others called it a movement. But Maya never called it anything. She just showed up every day at 7:45 a.m., turned on the lights, made a pot of cheap coffee, and sat behind the desk with a stack of letters from strangers. Some sent tips, some sent stories. Some just said, "Thank you." She answered every single one. Not because she had to, but because someone finally was listening. One Tuesday morning, a teenage girl walked in. Maybe 13, maybe 14. Hair in braids, wearing a school uniform and holding a folder too tightly. She didn't speak right away, just stared at the shelves. Then asked, "Is it true what you did?" Maya didn't ask what part she meant. She just nodded. "It's all here if you want to read it." The girl looked down at her folder, then said, "They said my brother's trial wasn't fair." Maya gestured to the chair beside her. "Then let's start there." Years passed. Maya never tried to become a politician, never sought headlines. She didn't want a foundation named after her, or a scholarship fund, or a mural. She just wanted the room to stay open, the doors unlocked, the stories protected. And every time someone entered that space and whispered a name they were told to forget, Maya whispered back, "You're not alone." One evening, long after closing, she received another letter. No return address. Same handwriting as before. Inside, only 2 words. "Still watching." But this time, Maya didn't feel fear. She felt something close to peace. Because still watching no longer meant threat. It meant legacy. It meant someone out there remembered her father too. That night, she walked to the old pier on Lake Pontchartrain. The one in the photo. The one from years ago, where she held a fishing rod she didn't know how to use. She sat at the edge, pulled out her journal, wrote 5 words across the final page. They tried to erase us. Then she closed the book, leaned back against the wind, and whispered into the quiet. But the room remembers. Have you ever felt like your voice didn't matter? Like the truth you held tight in your chest was too inconvenient for the world to hear? If you've ever been silenced, dismissed, or made to feel invisible, then maybe, in some way, you've stood where Maya once stood. But let this story remind you, quiet doesn't mean powerless. Sometimes, the most lasting change begins with the person who chooses to stay standing even when the room turns away. And if that's you, if you're still standing, still searching, still refusing to shrink, then you are the story someone else might need. So if this touched something in you, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, share this story with someone who's still trying to find their voice, and let us know what it stirred in your heart. Your thoughts, your memories, they matter here. Because this isn't just a place for stories. It's a place for people who believe in telling them. And, as Maya once wrote in her journal, they tried to erase us, but the room remembers. We'll see you in the next story. Stay tuned.